Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. The fact that this video is recorded in HDR means we have HDR support in Silent Hill 2, and that's actually really exciting because I was a little bit concerned that we ending up just with SDR in this game, but thanks God we have proper HDR support. How good HDR is in this game? Let's find out. And as always, let's start with the very important things first. Does Silent Hill 2 Remake on the PlayStation 5 supports the HDR system level calibration? And the very quick answer is no, but that's not a big deal because we have literally tons, a lot, millions of HDR settings in the game. And now let's take a closer look on the HDR settings, what we have in the game, and we're starting with the HDR maximum luminance slider, then we have the HDR mid luminance slider, then we have the HDR minimum luminance slider, HDR brightness, user interface brightness, and user interface contrast. So you can see there are a lot of options to talk about. So let's talk about the HDR maximum luminance slider first, which is responsible for the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. The standard factory setting is 1000, but even you increase this value to 5000, the maximum value, it is very unlikely that you have a lot of very bright objects on the screen. So there are just a few objects where you can reach actually the maximum peak brightness what you have set in the game. The next setting is the HDR mid luminance slider, and this setting is responsible for the midtones, but it is also affecting the HDR black level floor and the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. The next HDR setting what we have is the HDR minimum luminance slider, and this setting is responsible for showing you less or more details on very dark objects. And then we have the HDR brightness setting, which is responsible for the average picture brightness in the game. But this setting is also affecting the HDR black level floor and the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. And then we have the HDR user interface brightness and the HDR user interface contrast setting, and those settings, both settings are responsible for HUD elements or the brightness of the menu. So you can adjust those settings, user interface brightness setting and user interface contrast setting, as you like it. So let's talk about the HDR black level floor in this game, and I'm not very happy about this because we have always some sort of HDR black level raise. Despite, you can actually adjust a lot in the game, it is not quite possible to get completely rid of, because then you would lose a lot of details on very dark objects. So this is a little bit of a disappointment, but I found actually settings, my recommended settings, where the HDR black level floor is as good as possible. And before we're now talking about my recommended HDR settings in Silent Hill 2 Remake on the PlayStation 5, and I'm very sure also for the PC, let's talk about HDR, about the HDR quality in general. And in my opinion, this game is not made to show off HDR on your brand new OLED TV or LCD screen because, first of all, we have other games for this where you can do this much better, like Horizon Forbidden West. And second of all, Silent Hill 2 struggles actually to deliver a proper or very good HDR impression. So that's not because the HDR implementation is bad, despite the fact that we have actually some sort of HDR black level raise all the time. I still think the HDR implementation is on a good level. Not great, just good. But the problem is because of the design choice, because of how Silent Hill is made. there are not many specular highlights in this game. And what does it mean is very simple. The game just offers an average contrast. And this is not just because we have always some sort of HDR black level rays. This is also because we have not very bright specular highlights. So I'm not saying that HDR in Silent Hill 2 is bad. I'm just saying that it is on an average level compared to other games. But again, this is most likely a design choice because this game should not feature a lot of specular highlights. It should be a little bit dull, a little bit depressing. You get my point, okay? So again, just because we have slightly HDR black level rays and not perfect or not the maximum peak brightness in some specular highlights doesn't mean HDR is bad. It's just not meant to show off your brand new TV. And now let's talk about my recommended settings because I think I found better HDR settings compared to the standard factory settings. So keep in mind that all the time when you watch my comparison here right now, the maximum HDR luminance slider was set to 1500 nits. The left picture shows the standard factory settings with 1500 nits maximum peak brightness. The right picture, on the other hand, shows additional settings also with 1500 nits maximum peak brightness. And I think it is very clear which one has the better contrast and which one just looks in general better. So let's start with the HDR luminance slider, and my recommendation here is very simple. Just use the maximum peak brightness on your TV. But if you're unsure about this, then just increase this to the absolute maximum and just see how you go. Because again, I told you, most of the time, the HDR peak brightness in specular highlights is anyway limited. So again, try to find out the maximum peak brightness of your TV screen monitor and use this setting. If you don't know it, then just go higher than expected because it is better to have a higher maximum peak brightness in specular highlights than a too low one. The next setting is the HDR mid luminance slider, and I would actually recommend to increase this to 20. Then we have the HDR minimum luminance slider, and I would recommend to decrease this to -12. And last but not least, you increase the HDR brightness to 2.5. In regards of the user interface brightness and contrast setting, I told you already, you can set up this value or setting as you like it. Okay, my friends, so that's it for this video. Let me know what you think about my recommended HDR settings. Let me know what settings are you using in combination with what monitor screen TV, because then we can compare. I'm looking forward for all the comments, and I say thank you very much for your support. I see you next time. Bye.